On the night of January 30th, 1945, in the frozen waters of the Baltic Sea, 9,000 people drowned in 40 minutes. 6 times more than the Titanic. Most were women. Most were children. The water was so cold that even strong swimmers froze before they could reach the lifeboats. This is the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history. And almost no one has ever heard of it. To understand what happened that night, we need to go back to the winter of 1945. The Second World War is ending. Germany is collapsing. The Soviet Red Army is advancing westward across Eastern Europe, and their revenge is brutal. Millions of German civilians, families, elderly men and women, wounded soldiers, are fleeing ahead of the advancing front lines. They're trying to escape by any means possible, on foot, by train, by wagon, and by sea. This mass evacuation has a name, Operation Hannibal. It will become the largest sea evacuation in human history, far larger than Dunkirk. Over 2 million people will be moved across the Baltic Sea between January and May of 1945. But not all of them will make it. The Baltic in the dead of winter is one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. The air temperature hovers around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The water is even colder, just below freezing. Ice forms in thick sheets along the coastline. And beneath the surface, Soviet submarines are hunting. The Wilhelm Gustloff was never meant to be a refugee ship. She was built in 1937 as a luxury cruise liner, part of the Nazi Strength Through Joy program. She could carry 2,000 passengers in comfort, theaters, swimming pools, sun decks. She was named after a Nazi official who had been assassinated in Switzerland. But by January of 1945, the Gustloff had been repurposed. She was now a transport vessel, anchored in the port of Gotenhafen, today called Gdynia in northern Poland. And on the morning of January 30th, thousands of refugees began boarding her. The official capacity was fewer than 2,000 people. By the time the gangways were pulled up, more than 10,000 were crammed aboard. Mothers holding infants, teenage girls fleeing rumors of Soviet soldiers, wounded German soldiers on stretchers, elderly grandparents who could barely walk. They packed the decks, they filled the hallways, they sat in stairwells and storage rooms. Some had no belongings, just the clothes on their backs. Others clutched suitcases with a few precious possessions, photographs, jewelry, letters. Many had been traveling for weeks. They were exhausted, hungry, and terrified. But they believed that once they reached the western ports, Kiel or Flensburg, they would be safe. They believed the ship would save them. At the same time, 70 miles to the northwest, a Soviet submarine was moving through the dark water. Her name was S-13. Her captain was Alexander Marinesko, a skilled but controversial officer. He had been drinking heavily in the days before, and his superiors were considering disciplinary action. This patrol was his chance to prove himself. The Baltic was full of German ships fleeing westward, and Marinesko's orders were clear. sink anything flying the German flag. He had no way of knowing what the Wilhelm Gustloff was carrying. He had no way of knowing that most of the people aboard were civilians. And even if he had known, it's unclear whether it would have mattered. This was total war. At approximately 8 o'clock that evening, the Wilhelm Gustloff left the harbor at Gotenhafen and began moving west through the shallow coastal waters of the Baltic. The ship's captain knew the danger. Soviet submarines had been sinking German vessels for months, but he also knew that staying in port was even more dangerous. The Red Army was only days away. The night was dark, the sea was calm, the temperature was dropping. And somewhere in the black water ahead, Alexander Marinesko was watching through his periscope. Tonight we're going to walk through what happened on the Wilhelm Gustloff, step by step, slowly and calmly. We'll follow the refugees as they board the ship. We'll stand on the deck as the torpedoes strike. We'll listen to the survivors describe the chaos, the cold, and the impossible choices they faced in the water. This is a story of tragedy, but also of resilience, of people who made it through the worst night of their lives and carried that memory for decades afterward. This is the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff. Let's begin. Gotenhafen, January 30th, 1945. The port is chaos. For weeks, trains have been arriving from the east, packed with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. They come from East Prussia, from Pomerania, from towns and villages that no longer exist. Many have walked for days through the snow before reaching a train station. Now they're here, at the frozen edge of the Baltic Sea, and the harbor is their last hope. The temperature this morning is 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky is heavy and gray. Ice clings to the edges of the pier. 4 ships are docked in the harbor. The largest is the Wilhelm Gustloff, a massive white ocean liner that once carried tourists on pleasure cruises. Now her hull is painted gray, and her decks are crowded with people who have nowhere else to go. The Gustloff was supposed to leave 2 days ago, but mechanical problems delayed her departure. That delay may have saved some lives. It may have doomed others. Because in those 2 extra days, thousands more refugees arrived at the port. And when the announcement came that the Gustloff would finally sail, they all tried to board at once. Pause 2 seconds. Narrator. There are no tickets, no passenger lists, no organized boarding process. There is only survival. Me tell you about some of the people who boarded the Wilhelm Gustloff that morning. Their names come from survivor testimonies, from ship manifests, and from the records of those who did not survive. Pause 2 seconds. Narrator. Eva Dorn was 22 years old. She was a nurse from Königsberg, traveling with a group of wounded soldiers. She had been working in a field hospital when the Soviet army broke through the German lines. The hospital was evacuated with only 30 minutes' notice. Eva grabbed her medical bag and nothing else. She helped carry stretchers of wounded men through the snow to the train station. Some of the men died on the train. Their bodies were left on the platform at Gotenhafen because there was no time to bury them. Eva boarded the Gustloff with 12 wounded soldiers in her care. She found space for them on the floor of a corridor on the lower deck. The air smelled of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. The men lay on thin blankets. Some were missing limbs. All of them were in pain. Eva stayed with them. She had no morphine left. All she could do was hold their hands and tell them they were going home. Inge Weber was 19. She had given birth to her first child, a daughter, 3 weeks earlier in a Red Cross shelter. The baby's name was Petra. Inge's husband was a soldier on the Eastern Front. She hadn't heard from him in 2 months. Inge wrapped Petra in every piece of clothing she owned, 2 blankets, a wool sweater, a scarf. The baby was so small that Inge could hold her in one arm. When Inge reached the gangway, a sailor tried to stop her. He said the ship was already overloaded, but Inge pushed past him. She climbed the metal stairs with her baby pressed against her chest, and she found a place to sit in a storage room near the bow. There were 20 other women in that room. Some had children, some were alone. They sat in silence, shoulder to shoulder, trying to stay warm. Inge did not know that the room she was sitting in was directly above the forward cargo hold. The hold that would take the first torpedo. Pause 4 seconds. Visual photo of elderly couple, 1940s. Narrator. Otto and Frieda Schneider were both 71 years old. They had been married for 48 years. They owned a small farm outside Elbing, a town in East Prussia. When the Red Army approached, they loaded a wagon with a few belongings: a clock, a photo album, a set of silver spoons that had belonged to Frieda's mother. They traveled by wagon, then by train, then on foot. The journey took 11 days. Otto's knees were bad. Frieda had a cough that wouldn't go away. When they finally reached Gotenhafen, they were told the ships were full. But Otto found a naval officer and begged him. The officer looked at their faces and said, "Get on, quickly." Otto and Frieda climbed aboard the Gustloff and found a place on the promenade deck. They sat on a bench, holding hands, watching the gray sky. Frieda said, "At least we're together." Otto nodded. He didn't say anything, but he tightened his grip on her hand. By noon on January 30th, more than 10,000 people were aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff. The exact number will never be known. There was no time to count, no time to record names. What we do know is this: the ship was built to carry fewer than 2,000 passengers. Now she was carrying at least 5 times that number, possibly more. Every cabin was full. Every corridor was packed. People sat on the staircases. They stood in the hallways. They crowded onto the open decks, even though the wind was freezing. The bathroom stopped working within hours. The air inside the ship became thick and stale. Children cried. Adults spoke in low, exhausted voices. Some people tried to sleep sitting up, leaning against the walls. There was almost no food. The ship's kitchen had supplies for a few hundred passengers, not 10,000. A few people had brought bread or sausage with them, but most had nothing. Some mothers melted snow in their hands to give their children water. On the upper decks, the wind was brutal, but at least there was fresh air. A teenage girl named Helga stood at the railing, watching the port. She had been traveling alone since her village was evacuated. Her parents had told her to go ahead. They would follow on the next transport. She never saw them again. Helga pulled her coat tighter and stared at the dock. She thought about jumping off, walking back into the city, waiting for her parents. But she didn't. She stayed on the ship. Years later, she would say that decision saved her life and ruined it. Below decks, in the crew quarters, 500 German submariners were trying to find space to sit. They were young men, most in their late teens or early 20s, who had been training at a nearby naval academy. They wore their gray uniforms and carried small duffel bags. They were told they were being evacuated to Kiel, where they would join U-boat crews in the final defense of the Reich. Some of them were excited, some were afraid, most were just tired. They had no idea that the ship they were sailing on had almost no defenses, no destroyer escort, no air cover, just a few anti-aircraft guns and a hope that the Soviet submarines wouldn't find them. One young submariner, his name was Rudy, sat on the floor with his back against a metal wall. He took out a pencil and a scrap of paper and began writing a letter to his mother. He never finished it. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon on January 30th, the gangways were pulled up. The Wilhelm Gustloff was ready to sail. On the bridge, the ship's captain, Friedrich Petersen, stood at the wheel. He was a veteran officer, 51 years old, with decades of experience at sea. But he had never commanded a ship carrying this many lives. Petersen knew the risks. Soviet submarines had been sinking German ships all winter. Just days earlier, the transport ship General von Steuben had been torpedoed and sunk with the loss of thousands of lives. But staying in port was not an option. The Red Army was less than 100 miles away. If the Gustloff stayed docked, she would be captured or destroyed. Petersen made his decision. They would sail. But there was a problem. The usual route west, the deeper water farther from shore, was believed to be heavily mined. German minesweepers had not cleared it in weeks. So Petersen chose a different route, the shallow coastal lane closer to shore. It was supposed to be safer. But it wasn't. Because the shallow coastal lane was exactly where Soviet submarines hunted. The deeper water was too risky for their submarines to operate, so they waited in the shallows, listening for the sound of German ships. At 1 o'clock, the Wilhelm Gustloff's engines began to turn. The ship pulled away from the dock slowly, carefully. Ice scraped against her hull. On the decks, people waved to those still on shore. Some cried. Some stood in silence. Inge Weber, the young mother, held her baby and looked back at the city. She wondered if her husband was still alive. She wondered if she would ever see Germany again. Otto and Frieda sat on their bench and watched the coastline disappear into the gray afternoon light. Eva Dorn, the nurse, checked on her wounded soldiers. One of them was shivering. She took off her own coat and laid it over him. And 70 miles to the northwest, Captain Alexander Marinesko stood in the control room of submarine S-13, studying a chart of the Baltic Sea. His sonar operator called out, "Contact, large vessel moving west." Marinesko looked at the chart. He calculated speed and distance. Then he gave the order. "Set an intercept course." The Wilhelm Gustloff was sailing at roughly 15 knots, about 17 miles per hour. She stayed close to the coast, following the shallow shipping lane. The weather was cold but calm. Visibility was good. The sea was quiet. On paper, everything was going according to plan. But the plan had one fatal flaw. Soviet submarines were not where German command thought they were. And the Wilhelm Gustloff was heading directly toward one. For the next 6 hours, the ship moved steadily through the Baltic. Inside, people tried to find ways to pass the time. Some talked quietly, some prayed, some stared at the walls and said nothing. Children asked their mothers, "When will we get there?" And the mothers answered, "Soon, we'll be there soon." By 8 o'clock that evening, the sun had set. The ship was moving through darkness now. The only lights were the dim bulbs in the corridors and the navigation lights on the bridge. Most of the passengers didn't know that the ship's captain had made another decision that afternoon, a decision that would seal their fate. He had ordered the ship's navigation lights to be turned on. He believed that another German ship was in the area, and he wanted to avoid a collision. But turning on the lights made the Wilhelm Gustloff visible for miles, including to the submarine that was now less than 2 miles away. At approximately 8:45 p.m., Alexander Marinesko raised his periscope and looked through the eyepiece. And there, silhouetted against the dark winter sky, he saw the Wilhelm Gustloff. Her lights were on. She was moving slowly. She had no escort. Marinesko turned to his crew and said, "We attack." 70 meters below the surface of the Baltic Sea, Submarine moved silently through the dark water. The control room was tight and narrow. 20 men worked in near silence, their faces lit by the green glow of instruments. The air smelled of diesel fuel, sweat, and salt water. Captain Alexander Marinesko stood at the periscope, his eye pressed against the rubber eyepiece. Through the lens, he could see the Wilhelm Gustloff, a massive gray shape moving steadily westward, her navigation lights glowing against the night sky. Marinesko was 32 years old. He had been a submarine commander for 3 years. He was skilled, aggressive, and, according to his superiors, difficult. He drank too much. He questioned orders. He had been threatened with demotion more than once. But he was also one of the best hunters in the Soviet submarine fleet. And tonight, he had found the largest target of his career. Marinesko lowered the periscope and turned to his crew. "Range," he said. The sonar operator checked his instruments. 3,000 meters, Captain, bearing 270. Marinesko nodded. 3,000 meters, just under 2 miles. A speed. 12 to 15 knots. She's moving slow. Marinesko did the calculations in his head. The target was large, slow, and sailing in a straight line. She had no escort ships, no zigzag pattern to avoid torpedoes. She was either badly commanded or desperate. Or both. Prepare tubes 1, 2, and 3, Marinesko said. We'll fire a spread. I want all 3 torpedoes in the water within 8 seconds. The crew moved quickly. In the forward torpedo room, 3 men opened the heavy metal doors of the torpedo tubes. Inside each tube was a Type 53 torpedo, 23 feet long, weighing nearly 2 tons, carrying a warhead filled with 800 pounds of high explosive. The torpedoes were armed. The firing mechanisms were locked. The crew waited for the order. Marinesko raised the periscope again. The Wilhelm Gustloff was closer now. He could see her superstructure, the shape of her smokestacks, the faint glow of windows along her hull. He had no way of knowing what was inside that ship. No way of knowing that most of the people aboard were women, children, and elderly refugees. Soviet intelligence had reported that the Wilhelm Gustloff was a troop transport, carrying soldiers, naval personnel, and military equipment. Marinesko believed he was attacking a legitimate military target. Whether that belief was accurate or not, history does not agree. But in that moment, in the cold metal belly of submarine S-13, Alexander Marinesko made his decision. Close to 1,500 meters, he ordered. Maintain course, silent running. The submarine's engines dropped to their quietest setting. The boat glided through the water like a predator. 1,500 meters, less than a mile. Marinesko watched the target grow larger in his periscope. Aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, 9 o'clock had just passed. Most of the passengers did not know exactly where they were. They knew they were sailing west. They knew they were moving away from the Soviet army. That was enough. In the lower corridors, people had found ways to make small spaces feel almost bearable. Mothers sang quiet lullies to children who couldn't sleep. A few people shared food, a piece of bread, a wrinkled apple. An old man played a harmonica softly, trying to calm the nerves of those around him. In the storage room near the bow, Inge Weber sat with her baby daughter, Petra, asleep in her arms. The baby's breathing was soft and steady. Inge stroked her daughter's hair and whispered, "We're safe now. We're going to be safe." She believed it. On the promenade deck, Otto and Frieda Schneider still sat on their bench. The wind had picked up and the cold was biting, but neither of them wanted to go inside. The air below decks was too thick, too heavy. Frieda pulled her scarf tighter around her neck. "Do you think we'll see the farm again?" she asked. Otto looked at the dark water. "No," he said quietly, "I don't think so." Frieda nodded. She had known the answer before she asked. They sat in silence, watching the wake of the ship spread out behind them like a pale scar across the Black Sea. Otto squeezed her hand. "But we're together," he said. Frieda smiled. "Yes, we're together." One deck below, Eva Dorn moved between the wounded soldiers lying in the corridor. She had no medicine left, no bandages. All she could offer was her presence. One of the soldiers, a boy no older than 18, was shivering violently. His name was Klaus. He had lost his left leg below the knee in a tank battle near Warsaw. Eva knelt beside him and placed her hand on his forehead. He was burning with fever. Am I going to die? Klaus asked. Eva looked into his eyes. She wanted to lie. She wanted to tell him he would be fine. But she couldn't. I don't know, she said softly, but I'm here, you're not alone. Klaus closed his eyes. A single tear ran down his cheek. Eva stayed beside him, holding his hand. On the bridge, Captain Friedrich Petersen stood at the wheel, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. The ship was making good time. They were roughly 40 miles from the port of Gotenhafen now, moving steadily west. If all went well, they would reach Kiel by tomorrow afternoon. But Petersen was uneasy. The navigation lights were still on. He had ordered them lit to avoid collision with other German ships in the area. But every instinct told him it was a mistake. The lights made the Gustloff visible for miles. An officer approached. Captain, should we extinguish the lights? Petersen hesitated. If he turned off the lights and another ship collided with them in the darkness, thousands could die. If he left them on and a Soviet submarine spotted them, thousands could die. There was no right answer. Leave them on, Petersen said finally. The officer nodded and returned to his station. Petersen stared out at the black water and prayed he had made the right choice. It was 9:04 p.m. 56 minutes remained. At 9:04 p.m., Submarine. It was 1,000 meters from the Wilhelm Gustloff. Less than 2/3 of a mile. Captain Marinesko stood at the periscope, his hands steady on the metal grips. The target filled his view now, a massive gray hull, navigation lights glowing, moving at a steady 12 knots. He calculated the angle of attack, the speed, the distance. Bearing, he asked. 265 degrees, Captain. Range. 900 meters, closing. Marinesko's voice was calm, almost detached. Torpedoes ready. From the forward compartment, tubes 1, 2, and 3 ready to fire, Captain. Marinesko took one last look through the periscope. The Wilhelm Gustloff was perfectly positioned. The shot was ideal. He stepped back from the periscope. Fire tube 1. A mechanical clunk, a rush of compressed air. The submarine shuddered slightly as the first torpedo left the tube. The Type 53 torpedo accelerated to 44 knots, nearly 50 miles per hour. It ran straight and true, its electric motor silent beneath the water. Tube 1 away, the officer reported. Fire tube 2. Clunk, another shudder. Tube 2 away. Fire tube 3. Clunk. Tube 3 away. All torpedoes running hot, straight, and normal. Marinesko checked his watch. The torpedoes would take approximately 60 seconds to reach the target. 60 seconds. He ordered the crew to prepare for emergency dive, in case the target fired back. And then he waited. Beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea, 3 torpedoes raced toward the Wilhelm Gustloff at 50 miles per hour. 15 seconds. 30 seconds. 45 seconds. Aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, no one heard the torpedoes. No one saw them. Inge Weber rocked her baby. Otto and Frieda sat on their bench. Eva Dorn held the hand of a dying soldier. Captain Peterson stood at the bridge, watching the dark horizon. And 9,400 people breathed in and out, unaware that their lives were about to end. 60 seconds. Impact. At 9:05 p.m., the first torpedo struck the Wilhelm Gustloff on her port side, just forward of the bridge. The warhead contained 800 pounds of high explosive. It detonated against the hull with a force equivalent to 1 ton of TNT. The explosion tore a hole in the ship's side 12 feet wide. Water rushed in at a rate of 200 tons per minute. The blast killed everyone in the forward section instantly. Inge Weber, the 19-year-old mother holding her baby in the storage room near the bow, never knew what happened. One moment she was whispering to her daughter. The next moment they were gone. The second torpedo struck 8 seconds later. This one hit amidships, directly below the waterline, punching through the hull into the empty swimming pool that had been converted into quarters for the female naval auxiliaries, young women in their late teens and early 20s who had been serving as communication officers. More than 300 women were sleeping in that compartment. The torpedo detonated in the center of the room. None of them survived. On the promenade deck, Otto Schneider felt the ship shudder beneath him. "What was that?" Frieda asked. Otto stood and looked toward the bow. People were running now. He could hear shouting, panicked voices echoing through the corridors below. "We've been hit," Otto said quietly. Frieda stood, her hand gripping his arm. "What do we do?" Otto looked at the dark water beyond the railing. Then he looked at his wife. "We stay together," he said. In the medical corridor, Eva Dorn felt the second impact shake the walls. The lights went out. For 3 seconds there was total darkness. Then the emergency lights came on dim, red bulbs casting long shadows. Klaus, the wounded soldier, grabbed her wrist. "What's happening?" Eva looked toward the end of the corridor. Water was rushing in, ankle deep already, moving fast. She had treated wounds on battlefields. She had seen men die, but she had never seen water move that fast inside a ship. She knew what it meant. "We have to go," she said, "now." On the bridge, Captain Peterson grabbed the intercom. "Damage report," he shouted. Static, then a voice, panicked, barely audible. "Forward compartments flooding. Bulkhead doors won't close. We can't stop it." Peterson felt the ship tilt beneath his feet. The Gustloff was listing 5 degrees to port already, and it was getting worse. He knew the ship's design. He knew that with 2 holes that size, flooding that fast, there was no way to save her. The Wilhelm Gustloff was going to sink. The only question was how long they had. Peterson looked at the officer beside him. "Sound the alarm," he said. "Abandon ship." The alarm echoed through every deck of the Wilhelm Gustloff. 3 long blasts. Abandon ship. But for most of the 10,000 people aboard, the alarm meant nothing. They didn't know where the lifeboats were. They didn't know how to put on a life vest. Many of them didn't even know the ship had been torpedoed. They only knew that something was very, very wrong. and the ship was tilting, slowly at first, then faster. The first two torpedoes had done their work, but Alexander Marinesko had fired 3. The third torpedo, intended to strike near the stern, missed the ship by 30 feet. It ran beneath the hull and disappeared into the dark Baltic Sea, where it eventually ran out of fuel and sank to the bottom. If that third torpedo had hit, the Wilhelm Gustloff would have sunk in less than 10 minutes. Instead, she had 40 minutes. For some, it would be enough time to reach a lifeboat. For most, it would not. And for 9,000 people, the next 40 minutes would be the last of their lives. 9:06 p.m. 1 minute after impact. The Wilhelm Gustloff was listing 15 degrees to port and sinking by the bow. Water was flooding through 2 massive holes in the hull at a rate of more than 300 tons per minute. In the engine room, 8 men tried desperately to keep the generators running. Without power, the lights would fail, the pumps would stop, and 10,000 people would be plunged into total darkness. They stayed at their post for 12 minutes. 7 of them drowned when the compartment flooded. 1 made it to the upper deck just before the water reached the ceiling. Throughout the ship, people were trying to reach the upper decks. But the Wilhelm Gustloff had been designed for pleasure cruises in calm waters, not for emergency evacuations in the middle of winter. The staircases were narrow, the corridors were crowded, and now, with the ship tilting, even walking in a straight line had become nearly impossible. People fell. They stumbled over baggage left in the hallways. They slipped on wet floors. Some tried to help those who had fallen. Others stepped over them and kept climbing. In the medical corridor, Eva Dorn stood in freezing water up to her knees. There were 12 wounded soldiers in her care. Most couldn't walk. 2 were unconscious. Eva and another nurse, a woman named Anna, tried to carry the first stretcher up the stairs. But the staircase was too narrow, the angle too steep, and the stretcher too heavy. They made it 3 steps before they had to stop. Klaus, the 18-year-old soldier with the amputated leg, looked up at Eva from his stretcher. "Leave us," he said quietly. "No," Eva said. "You can't carry us all. You'll drown trying." Eva looked at the water rising around her ankles. He was right. She knew he was right. But she couldn't leave. She knelt beside Klaus and took his hand. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Anna, the other nurse, grabbed Eva's arm. "Eva, we have to go now." Eva didn't move. Anna pulled harder. "You can't save them, but you can save yourself." Eva looked at Klaus. His eyes were calm. He nodded. "Go," he whispered. Eva stood. Water was at her thighs now. She took one last look at the 12 men lying in the corridor, men she had cared for, men she had promised to protect. And then she turned and climbed the stairs. She never saw them again. On the promenade deck, Otto and Frieda Schneider held onto the railing as the ship tilted further. 20 degrees now. Around them, crew members were trying to lower the lifeboats, but the Wilhelm Gustloff carried lifeboats for fewer than half the people aboard, and most of the lifeboats were frozen. The davits, the mechanical arms that lowered the boats, were coated in ice. The ropes were stiff. The boats themselves were stuck to the deck. Sailors attacked the ice with hammers and axes, trying to break the boats free. On the port side, the side tilting toward the water, some lifeboats were lowered successfully. But because of the extreme list, the boats swung inward and smashed against the side of the ship, splintering on impact. People who had managed to get into those boats were thrown into the freezing water 50 feet below. On the starboard side, the high side, the lifeboats hung too far from the ship. Even when they were lowered, people couldn't reach them. The gap was too wide. Some tried to jump. Most missed. Of the Wilhelm Gustloff's 22 lifeboats, only 9 were successfully launched. Each lifeboat could hold 60 people. 9 boats, 540 seats. For 10,000 passengers. Otto Schneider watched the lifeboats fail. He watched people push and shove. He watched a mother lose her grip on her child in the crowd. He turned to Frieda. "We're not getting on a lifeboat," he said. Frieda nodded. She had come to the same conclusion. "What do we do?" she asked. Otto looked at the dark water below. The ship was sinking. The lifeboats were gone. There was only one option left. "We jump," he said, "together when the water gets close enough." Frieda looked at the Black Sea. The temperature was well below freezing. Even strong swimmers would last only minutes. But staying on the ship meant drowning in a metal tomb. "Together," she repeated. Otto squeezed her hand. They walked to the railing and waited. 9:20 p.m. 15 minutes after impact. The forward half of the Wilhelm Gustloff was completely underwater. The bow had disappeared beneath the surface, and the stern was rising out of the water like the tail of a sinking whale. The ship was tilting at 35 degrees. Standing upright was impossible. Walking was impossible. People clung to railings, to benches, to each other, trying not to slide down the deck toward the water. The lights were still on barely. They flickered in and out, casting surreal shadows across the tilting decks. And then at 9:21 p.m., the power failed completely. The ship went dark. Darkness. Total darkness inside the ship. 10,000 people, most of them below decks, suddenly unable to see. The screaming began then. Not everyone, not all at once, but enough. Parents calling for children who had been pulled away in the crowd. Children crying for parents they couldn't find. People trapped in flooding compartments, pounding on jammed doors, water rising around them in the pitch black. This was the moment when many realized they were not going to survive. Helga stood at the railing, alone in the dark. She was 16 years old. She had been traveling by herself for 6 days. Her parents had told her to go ahead, they would follow. Now she would never know if they made it to the port, never know if they were looking for her, never know if they were alive. She looked down at the black water, rising steadily toward the deck. 20 feet below. 15 feet. 10. Helga had never learned to swim. But she couldn't stay on the ship. She closed her eyes, said a prayer her mother had taught her, and jumped. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees below freezing. At that temperature, a human body goes into cold shock within seconds. The blood vessels constrict, the heart rate spikes, breathing becomes rapid and uncontrollable. Most people who entered the water that night didn't drown. They froze. At 9:30 p.m., 25 minutes after impact, the Wilhelm Gustloff was nearly vertical. The stern rose 60 feet into the air. The propellers were visible above the waterline, still turning slowly, uselessly. People who had been clinging to the upper decks began to lose their grip. They slid down the tilting deck toward the water. Some tried to grab onto railings. Some caught hold briefly, then their strength gave out. Hundreds of people slid into the Baltic Sea in the span of 2 minutes. Others jumped deliberately, choosing the water over waiting for the ship to pull them under. Otto and Frieda stood at the railing, hand in hand, as the water reached the deck. They had been married for 48 years. They had survived 2 world wars, the death of a son in 1917, the loss of their farm, 11 days of freezing travel across a collapsing nation. And now they stood together at the edge of the Baltic Sea, in the dark, in the cold, watching the water come for them. Otto looked at Frieda. "I love you," he said. "I love you," Frieda replied. And together they stepped into the water. 9:38 p.m. 33 minutes after impact. The Wilhelm Gustloff broke in two. The stress of the extreme angle, combined with the weight of water in the forward compartments, was too much for the ship's structure. The hull fractured just after the second smokestack. The sound was like an explosion, a deep, booming crack that could be heard for miles across the water. The forward section, already submerged, broke away and sank immediately, disappearing into the black water in seconds. The stern section hung in the air for a moment longer. Vertical, motionless, and then it too began to sink. The stern section sank stern first, slowly at first, then faster. It pulled a current of water and air with it, a powerful vortex that dragged anything nearby down with it. People who were swimming near the ship were pulled under. Lifeboats were capsized by the turbulence. Debris, wooden planks, furniture, life vests, bodies swirled in the maelstrom. And then, 42 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the Wilhelm Gustloff disappeared completely beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea. She came to rest on the seafloor 140 feet below, in darkness, in silence. And above, on the surface, nearly 10,000 people were in the water. The Baltic Sea in late January is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Water temperature, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Air temperature, 12 degrees. Wind speed, 15 miles per hour. Survival time in water this cold, for an average adult, is 10 to 15 minutes before loss of consciousness. Death follows within 30 minutes. For children, the elderly, and the injured, survival time is even shorter. Most of the people who entered the water that night were wearing heavy winter clothing, coats, boots, layers of wool. In the water, those clothes became anchors, pulling them down. Life vests were scarce. Most passengers didn't know where they were stored. Others couldn't put them on correctly in the dark in the panic. And even those who had life vests faced another problem: hypothermia. Hypothermia occurs when the body's core temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. In water this cold, it happens fast. Stage 1: shivering, confusion, difficulty speaking. Stage 2: muscle stiffness, loss of coordination, drowsiness. Stage 3: unconsciousness, cardiac arrest, death. From entering the water to stage 3, 15 to 20 minutes. Some people lasted longer. A few lasted an hour, kept alive by adrenaline, by will, by sheer refusal to give up. But most did not. Eva Dorn had made it off the ship. When the power failed, she had climbed through the darkness, pushed through crowds, reached the deck just before the final tilt. She had jumped from the railing into the water and by pure chance landed near a floating piece of debris, a wooden cargo crate. She clung to it now, her fingers numb, her body shaking uncontrollably. Around her she could hear voices, people calling for help, people calling names: Anna, Mother, Johann. And then one by one, the voices stopped. Eva tried to keep moving, kicking her legs, moving her arms, anything to generate heat. But her muscles were stiffening. Her thoughts were slowing. She thought about Klaus, the wounded soldier she had left behind in the flooding corridor. She thought about the 12 men on stretchers who had drowned in the dark. She thought about her mother, who would never know what happened to her. And then she stopped thinking. Her eyes closed. Her grip on the crate loosened. A voice. Stay awake, don't let go. Eva opened her eyes. A man, a sailor, maybe 30 years old, was holding onto the same crate. His face was blue with cold, but his eyes were alert. "What's your name?" he asked. Eva tried to speak. Her jaw was locked with cold. Eva. Eva, stay with me. Keep talking. Don't close your eyes. I'm so tired. I know, but help is coming. You have to hold on. Eva didn't believe him, but she held on anyway. Because someone had asked her to. Across the surface of the Baltic Sea, scattered over several square miles, nearly 10,000 people floated in the freezing water. Some were in lifeboats, the lucky few who had made it off the ship before it sank. Some clung to wreckage, planks, crates, overturned rafts. Some wore life vests and bobbed in the water, unconscious, kept afloat by the vests even after their hearts had stopped. And some simply floated face down, their heavy coats dragging them under inch by inch. The youngest victim was 3 months old. The oldest was 76. Most were women and children. At 10:15 p.m., 70 minutes after the attack, the first rescue ship arrived. The Luru, a German torpedo boat that had been escorting a convoy 20 miles away, had heard the Wilhelm Gustloff's distress signal and raced to the scene. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Hans Dieter Hornkohl, later described what he saw. The water was covered with debris and bodies. Hundreds of people were calling for help, but most were too weak to reach the rescue nets. We pulled up as many as we could, but for every person we saved, 10 more slipped away into the dark. The Luro pulled 172 people from the water. Most were sailors, young, strong men who had been able to swim and hold on longer than the civilians. Very few women were rescued. Almost no children. By the time rescue ships arrived, most of the children were already dead. Eva Dorn was pulled aboard the Luro at 10:30 p.m. She had been in the water for 45 minutes. Her core body temperature was 89 degrees, 6 degrees below normal. Another 5 minutes and she would have lost consciousness permanently. The sailor who had kept her awake, the one who had told her to hold on, was pulled up after her. They were taken below deck, stripped of their frozen clothing, wrapped in wool blankets and given warm water to drink. Eva didn't speak for 2 hours. When she finally did, the first thing she said was, I left them to drown." She was talking about the 12 wounded soldiers in the corridor. For the rest of her life, she would dream about them. By dawn on January 31st, the rescue operation was over. 4 ships had arrived at the scene: the Luro, the T-36, the VP-1703, and the Göttingen. Together, they pulled 1,239 people from the water. Out of more than 10,000, 9,400 people died. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in history. 6 times worse than the Titanic. And yet, most of the world has never heard of it. Of the 1,239 survivors, 420 were naval personnel, submariners, sailors, officers. 78 were members of the Women's Naval Auxiliary. 54 were ship's crew. And only 687 were refugees, the civilians fleeing the Red Army. Out of roughly 9,000 refugees aboard, fewer than 700 survived. The survival rate for women and children was less than 5%. Most of the survivors were men, young men, strong swimmers, people who had training in cold water survival or who simply had the physical strength to hold on longer. Inge Weber, the 19-year-old mother traveling with her baby daughter Petra, killed instantly in the first torpedo strike. Both died in the storage room near the bow. They never knew what happened. Klaus, the 18-year-old wounded soldier with the amputated leg, drowned in the medical corridor when the power failed. He died in darkness in rising water, unable to walk, unable to escape. Otto and Frieda Schneider, married for 48 years, ages 71. They entered the water together, holding hands. Their bodies were never recovered. But survivors reported seeing an elderly couple floating together, still holding hands, even after death. Rudy, the young submariner who had been writing a letter to his mother, survived. He was pulled from the water by the torpedo boat T-36. He went on to serve on a U-boat and survive the war. He never finished the letter. Helga, the 16-year-old girl traveling alone, survived. She jumped from the deck, landed near a lifeboat, and was pulled aboard. She was one of only 53 children to survive. She never found out what happened to her parents. Eva Dorn, the 22-year-old nurse, survived. She was pulled from the water after 45 minutes. She spent 3 weeks recovering in a naval hospital, then returned to nursing. She never spoke publicly about the Wilhelm Gustloff until 1996, 51 years later. When asked why she waited so long, she said, "Who would believe me? And even if they did, what good would it do?" Captain Alexander Marinesko, the Soviet submarine commander who fired the Torpedoes. He returned to base 3 days later and reported sinking a German troop transport. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for his attack on the Wilhelm Gustloff. But he was never promoted. His superiors still distrusted him. He continued drinking. By 1946, he had been discharged from the Navy. He worked as a factory manager, then as a supply clerk. He died in 1963 at the age of 50, largely forgotten. It wasn't until 1990, nearly 50 years after the war, that he was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Some called him a hero who had struck a blow against the Nazi war machine. Others called him a war criminal who had killed thousands of refugees. History has never decided which is true. The wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff lies at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, 140 feet below the surface, approximately 18 miles off the coast of what is now Poland. For decades, it was a war grave, protected by international law, off-limits to divers. But in the 1970s and 80s, salvage divers began exploring the wreck, looking for valuables. They found bodies, thousands of them, preserved in the cold water, mothers still holding children, families frozen together. The divers reported nightmares for years afterward. In 2006, the Polish government declared the wreck a protected grave site. Diving is now prohibited. 9,400 people remain inside the ship. They are still there. For decades after the war, the Wilhelm Gustloff was barely mentioned in history books. No major films, no memorials, no international recognition. The deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history, and the world was silent. Why? There are 3 reasons. The first, politics. When the war ended in May of 1945, Germany was divided. The western half was occupied by American, British, and French forces. The eastern half, including the region where the Wilhelm Gustloff sank, was controlled by the Soviet Union. The wreck lay in Soviet waters. The Soviet government classified all information about the sinking. Captain Marinesko's report was buried in military archives. For decades, it was a state secret. The Cold War had begun, and neither side wanted to acknowledge what had happened. The Soviets didn't want to admit they had sunk a refugee ship. And the West didn't want to humanize German suffering when they were still processing the Holocaust and Nazi war crimes. The second reason, shame. In post-war Germany, there was little appetite to discuss German suffering. The crimes committed by the Nazi regime were so vast, so horrific, that many felt German losses, military or civilian, did not deserve sympathy. Survivors of the Wilhelm Gustloff rarely spoke about their experiences. When they did, they were often met with silence, or worse, accusations that they were trying to claim victimhood when Germany had been the aggressor. One survivor interviewed in the 1980s said, "We were taught that we deserved what happened to us, so we stayed quiet." For 50 years, the victims of the Wilhelm Gustloff had no voice. The third reason, the Titanic. In April of 1912, the Titanic sank in the North Atlantic. 1,500 people died. It became the most famous maritime disaster in history. Why? Because it happened in peacetime. Because there were wealthy, famous passengers aboard. Because the story was dramatic, an unsinkable ship, a maiden voyage, an iceberg. The Wilhelm Gustloff had none of that. It sank during a war. The passengers were refugees, nameless, faceless, poor. There was no dramatic iceberg, just a torpedo, just cold water, just death. And so the Titanic became a legend. And the Wilhelm Gustloff became a footnote. Visual maps of the Baltic Sea, animated arrows showing evacuation routes, archival footage of refugees boarding ships if available, calm, educational presentation. Narrator. But the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was not an isolated event. It was part of Operation Hannibal, the largest sea evacuation in human history. Between January and May of 1945, the German Navy evacuated more than 2 million civilians and soldiers from East Prussia, Pomerania, and the Baltic states, moving them westward across the Baltic Sea to escape the advancing Soviet army. Over 800 ships participated. Military transports, fishing boats, ferries, passenger liners, anything that could float. 9 ships were sunk by Soviet submarines or air attacks during the evacuation. But more than 2 million people were saved. Operation Hannibal succeeded. It was the largest maritime rescue operation in history, dwarfing Dunkirk by a factor of 20. And yet no one talks about it. The Wilhelm Gustloff was the deadliest single incident within the largest rescue operation in history. A tragedy within a miracle. The operation saved 2 million lives. But it cost 20,000. And history chose to remember neither. Visual, modern footage of memorials, if they exist, flowers laid on memorial stones, names engraved. The Baltic Sea coastline today, peaceful, calm, beautiful, contrast with the horror of 1945. Narrator. Today, there are small memorials scattered across Germany and Poland. A plaque in Gotenhafen, now called Gdynia, marks where the Wilhelm Gustloff departed on her final voyage. A monument in Darmstadt, Germany, lists some of the names of the dead. And in the town of Lübeck, a stone memorial reads simply, "In memory of the victims of the Wilhelm Gustloff, January 30, 1945. But there is no grand monument, no international memorial, no museum dedicated to the 9,400 people who died. Most of them have no graves, no headstones. Their bodies remain inside the ship, 140 feet below the surface of the Baltic Sea. In 2006, Poland declared the wreck a protected war grave. It is illegal to dive there now. The ship is their tomb, and the sea is their cemetery. Every year on January 30th, a few survivors, those still alive, gather at the memorials to lay flowers and remember. Their numbers grow smaller each year. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers. And when the last survivor dies, the Wilhelm Gustloff will slip entirely into history. Unless we choose to remember. The Wilhelm Gustloff is a story about war, but it is also a story about memory. 9,400 people died in 40 minutes on a January night in 1945. They were not soldiers. They were not combatants. They were mothers and children, old men and young women, nurses and farmers and teenagers. They were people trying to survive. And they drowned or froze or were crushed in the dark. Their deaths were not glorious. They were not heroic. They were simply tragic. War creates these stories. It creates moments where impossible choices must be made, where young nurses must decide whether to stay with dying men or save themselves, where elderly couples must choose to die together rather than apart, where 16-year-old girls must jump into freezing water because there is no other option. And then, when the war is over, history chooses which stories to tell. The Titanic is remembered because it was dramatic, because it was peacetime, because the victims were wealthy. The Wilhelm Gustloff is forgotten because it was wartime, because the victims were German, because it was inconvenient to remember. But the dead do not care about politics. They do not care about nationality or blame or who started the war. They are simply dead, and they deserve to be remembered. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, think about this. 9,400 people went into the water on January 30th, 1945. Most of them were women and children. They died afraid and cold and alone. They have been lying at the bottom of the Baltic Sea for more than 80 years. And until tonight, you may never have heard their story. Now you have. And now you will remember.